In 1704, we saw the colony of Carolina develop the nation's very first slave patrol. Slave patrols helped punish slaves who essentially were considered property. Shortly after, the model of these slave patrols morphed into something that remains justified and is what we call modern-day policing. Fast forward to the 21st century, this oppressive institution still lives. It's time to change that, we propose. Before we respond to the third substantive argument, and before we provide you with two nexus questions that will essentially crystallize today's debate, we have to clarify our advocacy. Look, the opposition argues that reformations can happen in a world in which we defund. However, this statement is predicated on a misconception that they are both mutually exclusive. At the point in which we leverage police funds against them to make an executive decision to change, we think that under side proposition, we don't just give police institutions an incentive to reform, we force them to. Now let's move on and talk about their third substantive argument. Their last speaker on opposition talks to you a lot about how police funding is equal to less violence in their third substantive. Here are two reasons why this is still not enough. First, our second speaker already conceded that our side is not saying that police officers never do anything good for society. We need to look for the examples, and that's exactly what we're doing. During the several weeks of 2014 and 2015, the New York City Police Office pulled back on broken windows policing that focused on actively patrolling for low-level crimes. About 2,100 fewer major crimes were reported. What does this mean? It means that if police are not actively patrolling for minor crimes and are responding to fewer major crimes, there are fewer opportunities for violence. Second, we need to talk about their examples. Their very best example was community policing and the idea that if the police and community work together, there will be more trust in the police. But this doesn't work either, because this practice deputizes white and wealthy community members to surveillance their neighbors, resulting in police and even more police actions based on racist attitudes and beliefs. Even if this isn't enough, we would much rather live in a world where less police violence and racially motivated actions exist at the cost of less police presence overall. Even if you don't buy those arguments, you're still going to vote in proposition because we uniquely mitigate the chance of aggressive police brutality to any person by not allowing them to have the resources to do so in the first place. And now there are two questions we must ask. First, which side will pressure police reform more effectively? Opposition talks to you a lot about how police departments should not be defunded, but held to standardize national regulations, which should comply with international human rights laws. However, we don't think this argument stands, and here are two reasons we brought to you as to why this isn't true. The first reason is rooted in our first speaker when she tells you that we uplift minority-dominated communities by causing police reform. This is very important because the reason that officers are able to do so much is that they have no reason to do anything different. The funding that goes towards aggressive responses and unjust actions have gone unchecked and untouched. Side opposition believes that we can wave a magic wand and say, please reform, whereas proposition establishes decency by explaining, if you want more funding, then you will reform. Opposition's best response to this argument was that the first things that will go when you defund would be the individual parts of the police systems that work for community involvement and not necessarily demilitarization. This response was insufficient because even if you take them at their highest ground and assume that isn't true, it doesn't matter because we on side proposition are advocating for the money to be invested in other types of programs in these marginalized communities. There are two examples, and here's why both of those examples do not hold weight in today's debate. Their very best example in types of reform they used was body cameras. But as we saw in Minneapolis and many other U.S. cities, body cameras and other reform measures were implemented as a part of the Obama administration's response for the call for police accountability. We have proven they are largely ineffective. Body cameras are regularly shut off by police and do not result in less violent behavior, while increasing surveillance of them being police. Their next very best example in reform was training. But at the very beginning of this round, our first speaker already weeded out the idea of training. We explained that training on implicit bias for the police has shown no demonstrable effect. Time and time again, we said that the officers accused of abuses were the ones leading the training. In their very best case scenario, they live in a utopia where you can reform something that was built on injustice since the very first day. That is impossible unless we propose. The second reason why this isn't true, it was already proven by our second speaker when they explained every time we tried to reform, we increased our funding. This is crucial because there is not a single era in the United States history where police were not a force of violence against black people or any people of color, even though during one of these eras we had different types of reform implemented. But now we have to realize what's the implementation. In their last speech, they talked about their best example, and they used the Minneapolis Police Department, which had the most progressive police reform. This department offers procedural justice practices as well as reconciliation efforts in communities of color. And still, George Floyd and 51 other black men, along with 15 American Indian men and 9 Hispanic men, were killed by the Minneapolis Police Department officers between January of 2000 and May of 2020. Reform with no strings attached simply has not worked, and it will not work. Especially when there are lives at risk, we finally put our foot down. Now you're probably asking what the second question we have to ask is. It's simple. Which side mitigates police violence? To the panel, you, me, and opposition can all agree that the only way to diminish police violence overall is to reduce contact between the police and the public. Opposition discussed to you a lot about how the level of police misconduct is overstated. But look back to our second substantive argument, where we told you that if we divert funding, then we establish alternatives to policing. So even if they're right, and even if their argument holds weight, we still mitigate the chance of another life that has my skin color to be lost. This is very important because in the event that we divert funding, which is our entire model on advocacy, as pointed out from our first speaker, when you divert funding, you fund ways that people don't always have to turn to the police to de-escalate situations. Opposition attempted to clash with these alternatives by explaining that police and how they're involved in almost every single interaction. So that's why our second speaker POI, how you could establish alternatives if they're so heavily dependent. But that's the entire problem. Everyone's instinct is to call the police in the event of an altercation or any situation, but our comparable materials show why we changed that altogether by decreasing the number of times that people directly interact with these police officers. We gave 3 examples. First, like alternative emergency response services. Rather than dialing 911 and having a police officer respond to an overdose, for example, a medical professional could respond. Our second example were SOWs as well as street outreach workers, which leverage street knowledge and social work to approach individuals and groups on a peer level. And third and finally, we talked about programs like Eugene, Oregon's CAHOOTS, which stand for Crisis Assistance Helping Out on the Street, where we work to alleviate situations and responding to emergencies calls involving a person with a mental illness. Because at least 1 in 4 every person killed by the police has a serious mental illness, and officers aren't trained in crisis management, which may result in mismanaging the situation which ends in police violence. Both of these examples and all 3 of these examples are impossible to come by in the world of the opposition because they will be underfunded no matter what. We take away the chance of them being underfunded in our model, but then their side asks another POI on why do we have to divert funding as our model to decrease the amount of police violence. Here's why. U.S. cities collectively spend $100 billion a year on policing, while needed investments in education, healthcare, and housing, and critical programs go unfulfilled, particularly in poor communities and communities of colors. New York City, for instance, spends more on policing than it does on Department of Health, Homeland Services, housing preservation and development, and youth and community development combined. All of these things contribute to the reason that police officers are called in the first place. However, our side of the house ensures they aren't going to be called in the first place. Now it's time for us to realize that side proposition is not saying that we end police brutality. We end the unjust actions within the status quo. All we're saying is we change the narrative of unjust and injustices that has run rampant within the status quo. We are so proud to propose.